The Veteran Lived Experience series features personal conversations with veterans who have agreed to share their story on topics prevalent in the veteran community. Veterans are joined in discussion by professional experts and members of the Veterans Health and Wellness Foundation team.
Living with post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. This event today it's part of a larger series that George Mason's hosting during the week of Veterans Day, which is tomorrow, November 11th. And this particular webinar is a joint effort from Mason's newly launched Military Veterans and Families Initiative and the Veteran Health and Wellness Foundation. I want to tell you a little bit about those, very briefly, about those two organizations, and then we're going to jump right in. The Military Veteran and Family Initiative, or MVFI, it's Mason's effort to give back to service members, veterans, and their family members. Through sort of our activity as a research university. We have four primary pillars, being a university. Education is one of those pillars. We focus on providing scholarships, specified curricular like pathways and programs for service members, veterans, and their families, and then support for students while they're here through our Office of Military Services, some dedicated career readiness resources, other similar supports like that. We also have a research pillar. As a research university, large part of our mission is research, and we have projects that relate to veteran service members and family members that across the board, from enhancing health and wellness to warfighter readiness and battlefield technology. The third pillar is training. We really focus on trying to train the future workforce. So making sure that our students who are going to be future professionals understand the needs, the resources, the challenges that might be specific to this population. And then finally, we have a services pillar, and that's where we really focus on providing services to not only service members, veterans, and family members at Mason, but also in the larger community. We have pro bono mental health services through our Center for Psychological Services, pro bono legal services through our MVETS clinic. We have free arts workshops through our Veterans and Arts Initiative and the like. So we're now trying to pull all those together in a cohesive whole through this initiative, the Military Veteran Family Initiative, or MVFI. One key part of this effort is partnerships with the community. And one of the partnerships that's sort of central to our efforts is our partnership with Veterans Health and Wellness Foundation. Today, we've had the president and chair of the foundation, Dr. Evelyn Lewis, with us. And I want to just thank you, Dr. Lewis, for joining us, and turn it over to you, give you the virtual floor for a moment to tell us a little bit about Veteran Health and Wellness Foundation.
Thank you, Keith. I won't take much time because I think the conversation between you and our guests today is extremely important, and it's actually a core reflection of the work that we are both trying to do. As Keith mentioned about the pillars for his organization, we also have 5, and once I speak a little bit about those, you'll see how closely they're aligned. Our main focus at the Veterans Health and Wellness Foundation is health and healthcare and healthcare outcomes. And so everything we do focuses on that. And so, of course, in focusing on health, we come to realize that the social determinants of health, no matter what we do to enhance one's health, cannot be accomplished if those other things aren't aligned. And so our partnership with George Mason is one of those that truly helps us accomplish our mission and goals, and also stands up against our 5 pillars, which are, the first one is amplify, where we go out into the communities, again, joining our partners and others to amplify the voices of veterans and their families in regard to what is happening to them and their families. And we advocate for equitable healthcare. Many people think that all veterans get their healthcare at the VA, which is far from the truth. The vast majority, some 80% or so, get all or some of their healthcare out in the civilian sector. And many of the healthcare providers out there are vastly unaware of that. Access to dynamic resources for the family and the community. Again, helping the family, the veterans and themselves better advocate for the healthcare that they need as they become more knowledgeable about the diseases, injuries, or illnesses that they have that may be associated with their service. And then academic, again, working with George Mason University is a great partnership because we also look to educate both those who are up and coming in terms of healthcare providers or allied healthcare professionals, and for those who are already at those levels, providing educational materials for them that help them better understand veterans. And then advancing what we call the Veteran Medical Neighborhood Consortium, which is where our partners fit. They become part of the neighborhood to help us address those issues. So thank you again, Keith, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So, as Dr. Liz said, a key focus of our partnership is to provide this type of outreach, this type of education, and this is for future professionals, for current professionals, and for the population itself. And that's really what today's discussion is going to be about. We're going to be trying to bring together expertise from healthcare and other professionals with expertise from those who have lived experience in this area as well. So today we're going to be really focusing on sort of the experience of living with post-traumatic stress disorder, living with traumatic brain injury, what that looks like, and how you can try to seek help for that. Quick note, we'll obviously be discussing typical traumatic events today that may be linked with these types of conditions. And so, if that's something that might be concerning to you, just be aware of that as we're going to go through this discussion. So, in addition to serving as the director of the MVFI here at Mason, I am a licensed clinical psychologist, and I've got clinical and research expertise in post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and how that impacts people's lives. So I'm going to start today with some sort of brief overviews of both PTSD and another really common condition in today's veterans, traumatic brain injury, or TBI. After I give that, some brief backdrop, we're going to turn it over to our main speaker, who is retired Captain Matthew Ho, who's here. Captain Ho is a Marine Corps combat veteran of the Iraq War. He also participated in the Afghan War as a State Department official on a provincial reconstruction team. In 2015, he received a certification by the state of North Carolina as a peer support specialist for mental health and substance abuse issues. And he's actually currently studying for his Master of Divinity at Naropa University with an emphasis on Buddhist studies and contemplative care. So, in addition to being currently a senior fellow emeritus with the Center for International Policy, he is a 100% disabled veteran. I'm going to want to turn the floor over to him now to give you a little bit more about his background and his experiences, and then we'll jump into the meat of the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Keith. And thank you, Keith and Evelyn and Tehran for putting this together, and Leslie and Annie and Sissy for helping to facilitate it. I'm going to be speaking mainly from the point of view of my experiences, but certainly if, and during the question and answers, if people would like to speak about the bigger perspective on veterans' mental health issues or traumatic brain injury, please, we can get into that. I'm happy to go into statistics and rates and the history of it. And, but for this, my little presentation here, I'll just be talking about my experience, because hopefully that can help inform understanding of what veterans go through, with, of course, the massive caveat that every veteran's experience is fairly unique. So, you have to take it for what it is, but hopefully what I've been through can help inform understanding of what other veterans are going through, as well as their family and friends, and also people who are not veterans, people who suffer from PTSD, from traumatic brain injury, from depression or substance use disorder, or moral injury. Because certainly those issues are widespread in our community, regardless of whether or not someone has served in the military. So I went in the Marine Corps in 1998. I had worked a couple of years in finance and publishing in finance and operations for publishing companies after college. So I went in January 98, became an officer in the Marine Corps, and I got to Iraq in 2004, and I was on a State Department embassy team that was attached to a U.S. Army division. I later went back to Iraq as the company commander of a Marine Corps combat engineer company. And then in 2009, I went to Afghanistan as a State Department officer on a provincial reconstruction team. When I came home from my first time in Iraq, I definitely had PTSD, but it was something that I thought was very manageable, something that I recognized, although I did not admit to myself. And it's something that other people saw in me. So it was the kind of it was the hypervigilance, it was the hyper alertness, it was the startle reflex. So anytime there was a loud noise, I would startle. My survival system would kick in, right? My fight or flight response would activate. I would have problems sitting with my back to a door or to an entranceway. If people came into a room, I had to scan everybody, constantly looking for threats. Drive by something on the side of the road, you tense up, thinking it's going to be a roadside bomb. So that was a type of PTSD I was dealing with after that first time in Iraq. The second time, and again, people, even though I didn't admit it, other people noticed it. For example, a woman I was dating at the time, I remember being in a restaurant with her and her saying, you can't even look at me, right? You're looking at everything else around here, but you can't even keep your eyes on me for more than 2 seconds. So it was definitely noticeable by other people. Now, when I came home my second time from Iraq, fall of 2007, spring of 2007, within a couple of months, the PTSD, of course, was still there. That hyper startle, the hyper vigilance, the hyper alertness. I began experiencing sleep issues, particularly nightmares. And a lot of these nightmares were extreme anxiety nightmares. So I constantly had dreams of trying to fire my rifle to stop someone from killing somebody, and the rifle falling apart in my hands, or the trigger not being able to be pulled, or the magazine falling out of the rifle. Those dreams were occurring every night, and they were very intense, very vivid, and very harmful in the sense that I dreaded going to sleep because of those dreams. With that came the alcohol use. With that, and I'd always been a big drinker, came from a family of drinkers, but the drinking was always, it was never medicating, right? It was, I probably am alcoholic because of my family history regardless, but in 2007, the drinking was for medicative reasons, right? To try and help me go to sleep, to try and help me combat these feelings I had all day. And then the moral injury kicked in. And moral injury is something definitely we can get into in the question and answer if you'd like, but that's where my suicidality started to happen. Dealing with the fact that I was not the person that I thought I would have been in certain circumstances. So I had understood, certainly being as a professional military officer, understood the horrors of war, understood what I was going to encounter. But in my head, the image was I was always going to have the white hat on, right? I was never going to be the guy wearing the black hat. Or if something occurred where I had in the past where I would have envisioned myself being the hero, right? Or being the person who would have done something to save someone, it didn't occur in actuality. So that kicks in as well, and that leads into suicidality. So by the end of the fall of 2007, I'm dealing with issues of suicide. I go to Afghanistan in 2009, and my thoughts are certainly, and I've heard this from other guys as well, other guys and gals as well, is that, I could die over there or I could die here, so I might as well die over there. And that's the type of what's, propelling you, what was propelling me. I come back from Afghanistan, and all those issues are just further compounded. I'm not getting treatment. I'm telling myself that I can deal with this on my own. And what's interesting to me as I thought about this prior to beginning this conversation is, again, after my first deployment, people recognized the PTSD in me. But when the PTSD, and probably at this point, early aspects of traumatic brain injury, but when the PTSD and the moral injury started to drive me to like really abusive, substance abuse behaviors. I was dealing with suicidality. I was, having all kinds of other secondary and tertiary effects of these of the PTSD. I I was able to hide it from people. There were very few people who actually knew what I was going through for years. The women I lived with knew about it, and a couple of friends. And incidentally, one of those friends is actually on the call, so I'm really appreciative that she's here. But other than that, most people had no idea what I was going through. And it got to be about until early 2012 where it was, okay, I remember one day very clearly, I was having breakdowns. I was unable to work. I was basically unable to function. I was getting very aggressive, very angry, putting, damaging, destroying things in the space where I lived. And you coming down to it of like, look, either go and do it today and get it over with in terms of killing myself, or get help. And I happened to be living with a woman who forced me to get help, forced me to go to the VA. And that got me into a meeting with a therapist, got me to stop drinking, got me on medication, and led me on the path that I am here now. There was one other question that Keith wanted to ask about any pre-diagnosis or pre-treatment struggles I've had related to PTSD and TBI. And no, for me, there is not. There was some, I think situational depression when I was a teenager because we moved during high school, so things like that, kind of the stuff that I think people go through, but nothing that I could look back and say, I had these problems, and then going to war magnified that. So in terms of the treatments that I've been through, I feel most of the different programs the VA has to offer. I've done cognitive behavior therapy. I've done prolonged exposure. I've done acceptance and commitment therapy. I've gone through, substance use disorder treatment. And those have all had varying degrees of success. Particularly with the CBT, the Cognitive Behavior Therapy, and the Acceptance and Compassion Therapy Act, as well as the therapy for substance use. I found that once I understood that this is a lifetime approach, that this is something I have to incorporate into my daily behavior, that this is something that I have to incorporate into my lifestyle, and this is something that I have to keep with me forever, the effects of that grew exponentially. I've also had 4 stellate ganglion nerve blocks. The stellate ganglion nerve block is an anesthetized needle. The stellate ganglion nerve block has been around for at least 100 years or so. And about 10 years or so ago, various doctors started to realize that it may have some possibilities with PTSD, because PTSD has such a physiological component to it. If you understand PTSD as, your limbic system or your survival system being stuck open, like what I like to tell people is you go to war and you spend every day at war hunting other people, and other people are hunting you. And when you come home, you cannot turn it off. You basically, that valve that puts out all those survival chemicals is stuck open. And what the stellate ganglion block does, in very lay terms, is it anesthetizes that nerve so that the production of those chemicals is reset. And again, this is very lay terms. The actual process is much more complex than that. But I've had great success with that nerve block. The effects have been temporary. The last one I had was 2 years ago. But the effects were very immediate and noticeable in terms of my involuntary physiological PTSD symptoms. So the startle response, the hypervigilance, the hyperalertness. The first time I think I really noticed the stellate ganglion block worked for me. And that the people who employ it, including the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration now, say it's got about a 75 or 80% effectiveness rate. What I found was that, I was driving down the road, and the trash on the side of the road that my mind automatically thought of as a roadside bomb, I no longer tensed up, right? I no longer had that hypervigilance, hyper awareness, that readiness to be put into action that I had before. So I found the stellate ganglion block to be very helpful. It's not going to affect your moral injury. It's not going to affect your, your depression or substance use, except in the fact where, maybe those are secondary and tertiary to the PTSD physiological symptoms. I should say in my path around 2014, I started to develop migraines, extreme fatigue, and cognitive dysfunction, brain fog, basically. And that coincided as I felt I was getting better, as I felt I was getting a handle on his PTSD. And so my doctors, looked at me, my psychologist and my primary care physician, and said, let's get you checked out for traumatic brain injury. And I thought to myself, there's no way I've got that. And I went and I did all the tests, and then, the doctor calls you and says, come in so we can discuss these results. And whenever you hear that, whenever they're not going to tell you on the telephone, it's going to be something a little serious. So by 2016, I was diagnosed with traumatic brain injury, and the migraines, the cognitive dysfunction, and the fatigue got so bad that for the last 5 years, I've not been able to work. I've not been able to have a paycheck. Now, things have changed since the summer because of some medication changes, as well as I think some life changes for me that have helped, but it's still something in terms of the TBI that I have to deal with in terms of managing what I do every day, so not to trigger that fatigue, that cognitive dysfunction, and those migraines. Meds are something I can definitely get into. I've been on a lot of different meds. There's value to it. There's not value to it. And certainly I've been on a host of different medications. If you print off from the VA the list of medications I've been on, the list is as long as my arm is. And, I'm 6'2", so it's a pretty long arm. In terms of other things that have been successful, exercise and diet, that's kind of something that everyone, it seems to know. It seems to be intuitive, as well as good quality sleep. But when you're in the midst of all this, it's incredibly hard to do those things. And so it was only, I think the exercise, diet, and good quality sleep only came about as I started to heal, as I started to recover, as I started to really put a great effort into managing these issues I was having. And finally, Keith asked me to speak about lessons learned. I think the first one I wrote down is communication. If you are not communicating to other people, you're basically hoping that they're mind readers. So as someone who is, and it goes the other way too, if you have somebody who you think is suffering or is suffering, and you're not communicating to them, you're not helping them. And so communication, and I wrote it down in all caps, but it is communication in all directions, on all levels, is for me the most primary thing. The second lesson learned was that this is and I touched on this already, but this is a lifetime issue of managing. None of this is going to go away. I guess there may be some examples of people who say that their PTSD is cured, that their brain injury got better, that their moral injury they came to deal with and that's passed on. But, those are outliers that I have seen. The people who I feel are doing the best with this are the people who have come to understand that this is an issue of lifetime management, that this is just as any other chronic disease or chronic illness that you have to take care of, say like hypertension. It is something that you have to take care of for your entire life. The idea being that the bad times, the tough times, when the symptoms really manifest, that those experiences are going to become more distant, right? The idea that you're going to have these bad waves overtaking you, that the time period in between that distance between waves is going to continue to get longer and longer. You're still going to get overwhelmed. You're still going to have these experiences. However, hopefully, if you're doing what you can and you're getting professional help, those waves come less frequently. And finally, the third, or I guess the third thing for me in terms of lessons learned is acceptance. And if it's not right up there with communication, it's a close second in the idea that you have to getting to the point where you accept that your life is different, that you are not the same person that you once were, that you are not going to go back to being that person, is a really great challenge. For me, the traumatic brain injury would have really affected me, really put me into a major depression if I had not already had the benefit of years of mental health treatment And if in particular, and I skipped over this, but if in particular I had not been so involved with meditation and contemplative practices, if I had not been already trained to distance myself from what I was going through, I would have taken that on as a representation or a personification of who I now am. So to go from being high functioning, to go from being successful, to always succeed in everything you do, to then not being able to earn a paycheck for 5 years because of these problems could have had particularly for someone who has issues of suicidality, could have had a devastating effect. But the use of meditation, contemplative care, and the support of professionals was what has gotten me through that, and has been able to has allowed me to go through my days, go through my life, and kind of get my life back on track. Another part of acceptance too is just learning to live with it. You could get really wrapped up about what's going on in your brain. You could start Googling it. You could start getting all, writing down lists. Okay, which symptom is the T? Because as probably most folks know, with traumatic brain injury and PTSD, and then moral injury as well, the symptoms overlap. So you don't know which is which. You can really go down a rabbit hole that would be very destructive for yourself if you got wrapped into those details. So learning to accept what you're going through without having to control it, without having to have 100% knowledge of it, is incredibly important, I feel like. And then finally, one last thing is with that acceptance, understanding how, and I give the VA in Durham here a lot of credit for this, because once I was diagnosed with the TBI, okay, and I was having a lot of cognitive dysfunction. I was getting overwhelmed very easily. I couldn't look at, if I had multiple screens open on my computer, or I tried to do more than one thing at a time, it was as if I was having a mental or intellectual or cognitive tunnel vision. It would just kind of shut down on me. And so with that, the VA put me through, in here in Durham, put me through about a 6 month long program where they basically helped me learn to rethink, to approach things differently. And with that was the acceptance of my problems, because I was very reluctant to accept that I had brain injury, very reluctant to accept, even though I couldn't do things, even though like I could just not actually do the work I did, even though I couldn't, drive my car, several days of the week, etc. I was still very hesitant, resistant to accept that. And just to wrap up, I'll tell you the thing that really got me to accept it was I used to go to that class every week at the VA. Used to sit next to this guy, and I can't remember his name, but he had been declared dead twice. He had been in IED attacks in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he had been declared dead on, in both places. And the guy was constantly getting surgery done, on his brain. He had a shunt. And I remember looking over one time, we were doing this test, and I remember looking over at what he was doing, and I realized he was doing a lot better on it than I was, right? And so the idea, this thought that, my God, this guy who's been dead twice is doing better on this than me. Well, maybe I really should start accepting what I'm going through. So it's experiences like that, I think, and this again gets back to the idea of professional help, and that there's no way you're going to be able to do this on your own, and that you have to be involved, at a community level, basically, in order to I don't want to say succeed, but to continue to move forward. And in the same things, all this stuff, is from my perspective, but certainly working with other veterans, working with their families and their friends, significant others, this certainly applies to them as well. So I'm going to wrap that up there and turn it back to Keith. And again, thank you all so much for joining us, and for, everyone at George Mason for putting this together.
Yeah, Matt, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sure we'll have some questions, some potentially, things coming up. I want to kind of return to a couple things, if that's okay, and just sort of highlight some things. And I think, and also maybe, ask you a couple of follow-ups. I was struck by your description. I think one thing that's important for people to recognize is that, when we talk about trauma, right, we're talking about, something that is life-threatening, or, threatening of serious injury, right, that you experience or you see. And the normal response to that, right? The normal human response is a lot of what looks like PTSD in the short term, right? You know, it's, you're thinking about it all the time. You can't stop thinking about it, or you're trying desperately to stop thinking about it. You're having nightmares about it. You're on edge. But then that subsides. And what we know is for PTSD, it doesn't subside, right? It sort of maintains. And one of the types of trauma that's most linked to PTSD is combat. And Matt, you touched on this already. You know, in part, it's almost just like the sustenance of your survival skills, right? It's like, you know, the things that keep you alive, right? If you're in a dangerous situation, are being hypervigilant, are being, you know, easily startled, right? You know, because you can be alert to threat. And so that is sort of instilled in you over months as this is the thing that keeps me alive. And then when you come back, it's like, now you got to turn it off. And sometimes it's not that easy to turn off. But I was struck by how you talked about how, you know, people saw it on that first deployment, but then later down the road, you were actually able to keep it fairly hidden. And I'm curious, like, you know, how was that for you? You know, I mean, was that kind of an intentional thing that you engaged in, where you thought, let me hide this, or did that just sort of evolve? How'd that come about for you?
Yeah, it's you know, actually, and for those who are in the psychology program and everything, I'm just in my coursework. I'm just getting into internal family systems in my coursework. So this kind of gets to that. Like I've made a lot of connections as I've been reading that. Like, oh, this makes sense. This is why, you know, some of it was, you know, my mind trying to protect me. Right. So because it was so bad after I got back from my second deployment, where I was getting to the point of suicidality, my mind really wanted me to avoid those issues. Like, you know, keep that door shut, because if I open that door, I'm not going to be able to close it again. And then it was the other idea. I didn't want people, you know, particularly, and I think, you know, in Tyrone Sims, who's on here, who's an Army officer and helped bring this together. You know, I'm sure Tyrone can speak to this as well. You know, you're an officer in combat. You're an officer. You know, you go and you lead all these young men, and you can't fathom the idea that you're going to ask for help from anyone else. It's antithetical to everything you believed about yourself. And it's also antithetical to the way you were trained. And this goes for all members of the military, but especially the combat arms. So like the Army and Marine Corps infantry and the guys that drive tanks and everything else. You go into the Marine Corps, the Army, or any parts of the military, and then you are trained through very scientific methods. I mean, there's no, the U.S. Department of Defense has spent billions of dollars, and that's not hyperbole. They've spent billions of dollars. How do we best scientifically train young men and young women to kill people? And you go through that type of training. Then you spend your time when you're in your unit training that, doing those things. And then you go and you execute that in war. And then you come home. And now I understand it's much better. But certainly when I came back, say in 2007 with my Marines and sailors, we had a couple of days of PowerPoint classes, and then we were let go. You know, like that was basically it. And you also have then the ethos, you know, this idea that you're a professional warrior. And so even though I would stand in front of my Marines and sailors and say, look, if you guys are hurting, if you need help, even though like as soon as we got back to 29 Palms in 2007, I had to go with one of my sergeants to the hospital because he was going to kill himself. You know, so even though you still say to yourself, this isn't happening to me, or I can manage it, or I can't let people know. And it's all of those things, actually. I seem to be saying all those things. Yeah. So you do. And then you start self-medicating, and you're spending a lot of effort. One of the interesting things I found about the stellate ganglion nerve blocks is that when I've had them, I have felt as if all of a sudden I am not trying to keep a mask on my face. I feel like I'm able to be more present. Like I don't have this, you know, and I'm not sure why that is, what the difference is in the chemical nature of my body then that's, you know, causing that. But it certainly is a feeling I have of like, I don't have to have this mask on any longer. And I think that might have to do with just the idea that, you know, with PTSD, when you're in that survival mode, you're going back to like your most reptilian form of the brain, right? And you're just, you're just trying to survive. And so that's why I said the people who did notice were particularly that time I lived with I had two girlfriends, and then another long-term girlfriend as well, and complete disasters of relationship. PTSD is a relationship killer. And one of the things with the two women I was involved with, and the one that I lived with, was intimacy was completely gone. I was just not able to have sex. Like, I just had no interest in having sex. It was no thought. It was just, I was completely numb. And that's something I don't think is spoken about enough with PTSD and also TBI, is what it does in terms of intimacy and sexual relationships, and how that is to me what I've seen the biggest killer of relationships of young couples. Because you've got a young couple, you've got particularly say a young woman, and all of a sudden now her husband will not touch her anymore.
Yeah.
And that's just does so much damage. And it goes back to the PTSD, because I am in survival mode. I am only trying to survive, having sex, procreating, mating, whatever you want to describe it as, whatever my body takes it as, is of no use to me. Now, what's interesting though about the sex thing though, as I found, is that my desire for other women was still there. So it was a very interesting, it was very interesting dynamic. I take that more as like the desire for other women was kind of like that conquest urge that men have, while, and this is again, very late terms coming out of my head, so take it for what it's will. While being intimate with your partner was something that had a more of a long-term goal to it, that my body and brain was just not interested at the time.
Right. So, so we've got, I know we've got one person up with a hand up with a question, and we've got a couple questions in the chat. So I want to reflect on a couple points there, and then I want to go to one of the questions that was in the chat, and then want to go to Evelyn, who's got her hand up. But a couple just points to reflect on there that I think are important is first of all, the PTSD can, as you said, is a relationship killer, right? I mean, it is dramatic, and there are two pieces to it. One is the understanding the person has, the partner has. Do they get where this is coming from? Do they have context for it? Do they, can they make sense of it so that they're not attributing the withdrawal that comes and the avoidance and, or the anger, and all of that as reflective of how someone feels about them, but as reflective of PTSD, right? So that's one piece, but then there's still the piece of, even if you get to that understanding, but you've now had that intimacy cut out of your relationship, that sort of closeness, both on an emotional level and a physical level, how long can you sustain that until you sort of say, well, this is not going to be, fulfilling, right, long term. So I think those are interesting.
Let me just add with that too, is that a lot of times the person involved, the partner, the significant other, whoever it is in the relationship, is going through that alone.
Right.
Going through that without any outlet, any support, any assistance, any community to fall into. And that's gotten a lot better, I think, in the last 10 years. And I certainly am so pleased to see with both of the organizations who are sponsoring this, you've got families in your title, right? I mean, because it's a community thing. I remember the woman I was living with, Meg, I remember her one time coming across something she had written after we had broken up, where she said, I knew Matt was dying inside for a long time because of PTSD, but I had no one to help us.
We could keep talking about that, but let me go, because we have had questions coming in. So let me go. There's one of the first questions that came in was just asking, could you talk a little bit more about how acceptance impacted your learning to live with PTSD? So, you mentioned kind of acceptance was a big piece of that. Can you just, elaborate a little bit on that? And then Evelyn, I want to come to you for a question next after that. Go ahead.
Well, I think with it, when you accept it, when you're open, right? Then you're willing to take on new things. You're willing to examine yourself. You're willing to do these different therapies with an open mind. And you go, and again, I'm very big into contemplative care now. And, this idea that I can sit here and hold my feelings in my hand, right, is something that, coming out of my culture, out of the Marine Corps culture, I'd rather punch you in the nose than hold my feelings in my hand, right? So it's breaking through a lot of that old shell, breaking through a lot of that, that conditioned behavior and those thoughts of who you are and who you want to be, and just having the courage. A lot of acceptance is courage. A lot of it is just being willing to look at it and say, okay, I'm going to walk alongside this, or I'm going to go with it, or I'm going to, see what happens if I allow myself to think this way, or if I allow this person to speak to me, or if I'm willing to open my mouth. So a lot of it is really courage. But without acceptance, again, without acceptance, it is because we're resistant. I think, again, the mind, I think, one, are as veterans, the way we were trained. I think, particularly, again, for men, the way we're brought up in this country, the way we're, again, conditioned, we are resistant. The stigma that comes with mental health issues in this country that has gotten better, certainly in my lifetime, but it's still there. All of that causes resistance. And how do you break through that? You need to accept those parts of you that have changed. You need to accept the idea that things may be scary and you have to take it on, that you are not going to be the person, that some of that conditioning was wrong or illogical, or, there's no evidence for believing in it. So acceptance to me is very critical, just in terms of people being able to keep moving forward each day.
Great. Thanks, man. Evelyn, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Keith. Matthew, you began to talk a little bit about what my question is related to when you began to talk about your relationships and intimacy and what have you. But I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and talk about your relationship with your parents, if they were there, or others who were closer to you that served as family. If you had siblings, if you had very close friends, how did those relationships evolve while you were evolving with coming to accept the issues that you were facing?
No, I didn't talk to them about it. I came from a family that we just didn't talk. That was our culture, good Irish, German, Catholic family. You don't talk about your problems. Very, very much that. And so, I've had to force myself to do that. Oftentimes, one thing that helped me was that when I started speaking publicly about it, I have an easier time talking to strangers about this, people I've never met, than to, certainly people who are close to me. And that's something that I have worked on quite a lot with, my various treatment programs. If my psychologist was here today, Dr. Berlin, who I've been working with since basically 2013, since early 2013, she could give you a whole case study on Matt's inability to talk about his problems to anyone who's close, And so that was a real problem. And I think that contributed a lot to me not getting help. That contributed a lot to me not believing I could handle this on my own, believing that would be some failure in my life if I admitted having these problems. So I came from a completely loving family. I came from a family. We all live within 3 miles of each other. My brother, my sister, my parents, their families, we all live. And, someone calls and says, hey, we need this. We all get up and help, and, family dinners together and everything. But that type of communication, I think, like you were getting at, Evelyn, just didn't exist. And so it's something I've had to force myself. And part of it, is I sometimes now when I do write about these issues, I do put myself out there. Like, I'll put this recording up on Facebook because my parents are on Facebook with me, and they'll see it. And so they'll know, what I've been going through, or what, that's been kind of like a very, I guess, passive way of communicating with my family. But certainly is, I don't, they weren't bad parents for it or anything. My family's not bad for it. It's just the way we were. And again, I think that comes from society. It comes from being the children. They were children of immigrants, who got here and the Depression happened. So you have all those tropes, right, that I think are true to a degree. Certainly, the more a family is able to serve as a community, the more as the communication is robust. And the other part too, I think, is the acceptance to listen. I think some of the problems that veterans have is that we feel like we're not going to be heard. We feel as if that we have to, we're immediately, if we're told, say with the moral injury, which is a big part of what I focus on now, and certainly has been a major issue for me in my life. I mean, again, that's a driving factor in my suicidality. The idea that if I opened my mouth and said, like, look, I did things wrong over there, you know, I did things that were morally wrong, that I took part in the killing and, you know, and everything else, then the response I'm going to get is going to be, but you were over there trying to do a good thing, or you were following orders, or, you know, I know you see it that way, but that's not the way we see it. You know, so I think that's a real problem, is that we feel like we're not going to be listened to, that we're going to, you know, and again, I still get this in you know, members of my family don't want to hear that. You know, if I say that, I'm just going to get a mantra back that you're a hero, you're doing a good thing. You know, so
Yeah.
part of that is that trying to break through and, you know, allow and be heard, allow who I am to actually be heard, as opposed to what people want to hear from us. And so I think that's a real issue that families have to contend with.
That's a great. I think those are great points, Matt, and I think it highlights some of the issues. You know, this comes up with a lot of times with people from trauma. You know, our instinct when we hear things is to, you know, explain it away or to make people feel better, right? You know, and it's a natural instinct. You know, it's like, you know, somebody tells us, you know, oh, I did this terrible thing, and you say, no, you know, we understand it wasn't terrible, you know, but that can leave that person feeling exactly like you said, unheard, right? Not understood, right? You know, and it breaks the chance to be able to promote that, and that is sometimes where professionals, you know, come in. You know, I mean, this happens even as people are, you know, we have a couple of psychology students on here, right? You know, I mean, it's like, you know, part of the learning of even learning to do therapy is sort of unlearning some of your natural instincts that made you want to do therapy in the first place, right? You know, to sort of jump in and say, that's okay. You know, we're going to make it better. It's like, we'll just slow down, right? You know, like understand what the person is saying. You've raised some interesting points that I think too are where we have less knowledge about, right? And I want to circle back to a couple more questions that came up in the chat, but just to take a moment, PTSD for a long time was understood as what we call an anxiety disorder, right? You know, the idea was it's based in the fear response, right? And we have evolved in our understanding of it to know now that there's more than just anxiety involved in PTSD. There certainly that's there, but this idea of moral injury, this idea that I, you know, I've either witnessed something terrible or I myself have taken part in something terrible that sort of undermines who I am as a moral person. That's a different kind of experience that can be very wrapped up in PTSD. But that, you know, that needs to be thought of, I think, a little bit differently sometimes. And I think we're sort of learning more and more about, you know, how do you talk with people about that? How do you work on that? You know, some of these sort of straightforward anxiety-based ideas, Matt, you mentioned, you know, prolonged exposure therapy, right? Cognitive behavior therapy. Prolonged exposure therapy is really based in this idea of treating anxiety, but prolonged exposure to the idea of moral injury doesn't make moral injury better, right? You know, so sort of thinking about how to work through that, I think is key. The other piece that we don't really know as much about, but we're certainly learning more and more, is traumatic brain injury. And I was really struck by your comment that really became salient for you as the PTSD started to improve some, right? So as you started to get that, right, you know, a little bit more, you know, under control, that piece of things rose up. And TBI, you know, especially mild TBI or severe TBI, right? You know, I mean, we know what that looks like. We, you know, that's we can get in there and look at the brain, but this idea of kind of repetitive mild TBI, particularly blast related TBI, which is different than non-blast, you know, than sort of getting hit on the head, this idea of blast waves causing different types of shocks to the brain. We're still learning about that and about what those effects are. And some of those effects look like PTSD. And so, you know, trying to disentangle those is you know, very complicated. But I'm curious if you could talk for a couple minutes sort of about that evolution for you, about sort of learning about, oh, maybe this is TBI, and then what that then led to. And then I do want to circle back to some of these questions in the chat. And then if people have more, please raise them. But yeah, could you talk a little bit more about that experience that you had?
And the other thing that compounded it too was just my sensitivity to some of the drugs I was being given.
Oh yeah.
I mean, so that compounded as well, where, that can certainly, medication can give you brain fog. Medication can, I mean, I had, there are some medications. I had one medication that literally made me so aggressive. It made me so angry so quickly. I remember a car pulling out in front of me, and rather than braking, I sped up to try and hit the car. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So like out of your mind type of aggression. And so there was what was happening was that, so around, like I said, 2014, these migraines, the cognitive dysfunction, the fatigue started setting in, and I was having some, other issues too, some anger, some real anger stuff that was occurring. And I had been doing well, and so my psychologist was really, unsure, like, why is this happening? And so and this is the great thing about, at least where I'm at with the Durham VA, they work as a team. I mean, so they come together, and so the idea was, well, let's get them in to look at a brain injury. And the thing is that, yeah, certainly I was a combat engineer, which meant I dealt with demolitions. I've been around hundreds of explosive blasts. And then there are other things too, like anyone else. I've had plenty of head injuries. These two teeth are fake. I used to like to box when I was in the Marine Corps, and I was not very good at it. So like there were like a lot of different reasons why I could have a brain injury, but certainly explosive, and it matches up. You don't know, and that's another part of acceptance that I want to say too, is that living with the uncertainty. When you first get diagnosed with something like brain injury, and then of course you watch that Will Smith movie about the football players, and you're convinced that you have CTE, and that is something that you have to work your way through. It's acceptance that you don't know, and you'll never know, or quite possibly you won't know until much later in your life. And then kind of, as I've been taught, what does it matter? Are you going to live your life any differently today if you knew you had that than if you don't? So, but that's a form of acceptance, allowing yourself to live with that form of uncertainty. And you do need help to get to that point, I feel, where you're comfortable with that form of uncertainty. But with the brain injury, as the brain injury symptoms, I'd like to say, the migraines, the cognitive dysfunction, the fatigue got steadily worse and worse, became on a more regular basis, to the point where, again, migraines, being bedbound 5 days a week. It's frustrating because you can't put your finger on it. You can't see what the problem is. They put you in the MRI machine, you come out of it, everything looks good. So they take blood, you're doing all kinds of different things, and it just keeps happening. And then you got to go on the medication regimes, which are very difficult because you have to give the medications at least 3 months. So, you've got to accept that you're just going to, and so it takes years possibly. And that's what it did for me. It took me years to finally find a medication that has, I get migraines twice a week now that that make me bedbound. That's much better than having them, 5 days a week. So, but it took me years to get to that point, because you just have to go through a list of all the different things that might help. So it's a very difficult process. Again, the meditation, the contemplative care contemplative practice is incredibly important for me with dealing with that, because it allowed me to exist alongside of those problems without believing that those problems were actually me. And I think if that had occurred, I would have gone into a real clinical depression that would have been very, very damaging to me.
Thanks. Yeah. Along those lines, one of the questions in the chat, and I don't know if you have thoughts on this or not, but if there was technology available, would it be possible to monitor mild brain injury in the field to try to prevent the sort of repetitive exposures that could be so dangerous, as they accumulate? I don't know if you have a sense of, if there had been technology, right? They could say like, ooh, that was a bad one. Do you think that could have led to changes in the way people sort of engaged in duties, or would there have been too much happening to really be able to integrate that in a,
They do wear pressure gauges now.
Okay.
I was I was a breaching instructor. So I taught people how to, if you see on the TV where you put a demolition charge next to a door handle, and, or you blow a hole in the wall or whatever, and you're only a couple of feet away from those charges, as well as the bigger charges that we would detonate, all often, monthly,
Yeah.
that, so, we didn't have any of that. So having that pressure gauge now probably helps. The interesting thing is the Army deployed to Afghanistan about 5 years or so ago, sensors to do that. They deployed the gauges on the soldiers. And there was a bit of the research team behind it, a number of them resigned after the fact because the Army stopped the deployment of those gauges because the data coming back was saying how damaging our own weapons were to us.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're getting about 4 or 5, and I can find the stories on it, but yeah, so there is from our own weapons, you're always going to have that type of concussive force that is hitting you. There's other things too. There's understanding out there that our helmets may contribute to the brain injury problem because that explosive blast comes up and into the helmet, and then it's trapped and it can't go in, right? So it bounces back and forth. And if you know anything about explosive blasts, when it bounces back, when an explosive blast hits the surface and comes back off, it is twice the strength that it was that it hit the surface at. It's an amazing, that's why explosives are such great effect. If you ever see how they bring down a building, they use relatively small amounts of demolition for that. And then the big thing for me is what they have done in terms of screening when the men and women coming home. They probably can certainly do a lot more, but certainly when we came home, say after my second deployment, and I had Marines that have been, Marines and sailors that have been hit directly by IEDs more than 10 times, that their personal vehicles that they were in had been detonated, had been hit by at least 10 different IEDs. And then most of us had gone through a whole list of other ones. And there being no traumatic brain injury screening when we came back, we came back to 29 Palms, and the Marine Corps and the Navy sent a TBI screening team from the hospital in Pendleton. And then as, the company commander, I was asked, which of your Marines need to go see them? And I remember talking to my first sergeant, and we had no idea. So we basically said, if you were in 5 vehicles or more that were hit, you have to go. That we just made up the number, 5 vehicles or more, right? We had no idea. Right. And then of course, because you're sending these young Marines to go talk to the doctor, they walk in there and the doctor says, or the corpsman says, how are you doing today? And they reply back, I'm feeling good. Are you having any problems? No, sir, not at all. Or no, ma'am, not at all. Okay, that's it. And so you have like this, the worst possible group to do self-assessment with, right? Young men that we recruited because we want them to be warriors, right? We're trying to recruit alpha males or whatever, and then we have this culture. So, but now, and this will probably, Tehran probably, be surprised at this if you don't know that the guidance now is if you are within 50 meters of an explosive blast in combat, including being in your armored vehicle, you have to be screened for a TBI. I mean, that would have, like for any of us, we would have been screened dozens of times, but that's the standard now. And so that's a good thing.
So it's an interesting point though, because, even as technology evolves, right, and as our understanding evolves, right, and then, maybe we get to that point, then it's like, well, now what do we do about that though? Because if this is basically almost a daily occurrence for, just about everybody, like how do you handle that? So there are some sort of realistic logistical pieces where is it preventable given the different missions, right? We had another question that came in just about what are our thoughts, and there's one also I'm sort of saving one to ask in a minute about how we think the military can support officers in particular, but what are our thoughts about how adverse childhood experiences might compound the effects of an adult PTSD or TBI? And I can tell you a little bit. I can answer that one a little bit just from the research standpoint. What we know is that the experience of prior trauma definitely increases the likelihood of developing PTSD after a subsequent trauma. And childhood trauma in particular, adverse childhood experiences, are tied to a whole host of vulnerabilities. And there may be a wide range of reasons for that. They may be psychological in nature, right? You sort of engender a sort of a vulnerability there in terms of either the way people interpret the world or experience feelings, et cetera, that then plays out into more vulnerability as an adult. there can actually be impacts on brain development. If you experience particularly a traumatic event, as a child, and you get the, or even worse, repeated traumatic events, when you think about things like child abuse, those kinds of things. We know that those types of experiences result in, elevated brain activity, things like, cortisol and activation of the what's called the hypothalamus, well, with the HPA axis, I'll leave it there. And anyway, and having those influences at a young age not only affects the brain, but can have effects on brain development. And we're still learning about that. We have people who are, there are people studying that, around the world. And we have people looking at sort of what types of impacts those types of experiences can have on kids. We also, one of the students on here is running a study right now looking at the impacts of hearing about a parent's trauma and what that can do, so there's a whole range of ways that these types of childhood experiences can play out. But it's also important to note that the majority of children experience an event that would be considered traumatic, but based on definition, by the time they are an adult. So it's the majority of people. And so really we're talking about severity, type. There's the research out there suggests that, how severe an incident is, who perpetrates the incident, if it's an interpersonal incident, right? Is it somebody you know versus a stranger? All those factors influence how that then plays out into adulthood. So it's a very complex web, to try to untangle. But we do, the short answer is they do make, they are linked with greater vulnerability on average, but it doesn't necessarily mean for any one individual that they will then become more vulnerable.
Yeah, and I would add to that thing, you got to look at who the military is,
recruiting.
I mean, you're recruiting, young men and women who come from a socio and economic background, a class that they're not getting the help for the trauma. They're not getting into therapy. The other side of that in terms of trauma is that I think is a lot of people see people who have experienced trauma tend to seek out trauma again, right? For whatever reason, I don't know why that works, but it seems to me that those who have had significant trauma in their lives are more likely to seek out further trauma. I see that with, and I think that's got to do with the PTSD, wanting to find a situation or an environment where you now feel normal. And I remember when I got to Afghanistan in 2009, my friend who's on this call with us, I remember sending her an email and saying, like, I feel like I'm home. I feel like I'm in a good place because I was back in a war zone, right? I mean, my survival chemical levels now match the environment I was in. I have, my first therapist had been a corpsman in Vietnam, so sticking his hands inside dying Marines for a year, right, in Vietnam, and came back and had to be became a paramedic in Baltimore, inner city, had to be right where the worst things were, where the most action was, you know. I think you see that my friends who left the Marine Corps and became cops or firefighters, they all say to me, I'm not having a problem with PTSD. I think it's because they're strapped, they're police officers, they're strapping a pistol on every day and they're living that experience again. So they feel normal. Now, of course, when they leave that, that's going to fall apart. But I think there's something to say about, so you then look at, in a sense of recruitment, how many of those that we're recruiting are young men and women who've had trauma, who are then seeking further trauma or seeking some way to, fill that void that's in them. So I think that's a very real thing, but certainly getting back to the original question, history of PTSD or trauma definitely, everything I've read and everything I've seen definitely correlates to, propensity for combat related PTSD.
Yeah. Evelyn, you've got your hand up.
Yes, Matthew, I wanted to sort of divert you a little bit more back to the family situation. So there are lots of families who would fit, if you will, sort of the mold of how you described your family. And then there are obviously others who would, in and maybe quite naturally want to talk with their veteran who is experiencing these issues. My question is, in regard to someone's family who is more like yours, who that's not the kind of thing that they discuss, what would be some of the things that you would think that might be helpful to them? Because again, just because people don't speak about these things or put the, don't talk about that sign up when you all are together, doesn't mean that they aren't being stressed or impacted by what's happening.
Oh,
And so,
yeah.
By being the organization that we are, our focus is on the veteran and the family, because the veteran isn't an isolated individual. Whether they're having these conversations or not, they're still a part of that unit. And so what are some of your thoughts about what you think would be helpful for organizations like ours or for others to be more helpful to families who approach the problem like yours did?
Yeah, I mean, I know with my family, and again, in incredibly loving, generous, supportive, but we just don't talk. And the idea of walking into a family dinner and being like, "Hey, I'm having this problem," like it's just not gonna happen. I mean, so like that directness is, and I think everyone understands their family better than everyone else to a degree, but that directness may not be the best approach. So maybe a more passive approach, maybe posting things on social media, maybe getting someone else involved, maybe getting a friend or another family member who would feel more comfortable, and who your family members might feel more comfortable with discussing, bringing this up. Certainly testimonials. I mean, one of the reasons why I started getting help was again, the woman I was living with, Meg, what she had me do was watch these. I remember her crying and like begging me, please just watch these videos, and it was from the Wounded Warrior Project, just testimonials from men and women who have been in Iraq and Afghanistan, talking about what they're going through. And I remember sitting there being like, my God, that's exactly what I'm going through. So hearing the experience of others, the testimonials of others, and getting people to watch it in a suggestive manner that doesn't bring the defenses up, right? That doesn't like bring up all those, that family way of, oh, we just don't talk about this, or this is making me uncomfortable, or this is too close, or whatever, but rather to do it in a manner that's more indirect. And that might break the ice, I feel like. I think that would be a way to kind of enter into the conversation and to take a, you're not talking about having like some kind of intervention where everybody is sitting around in a circle, right? And you got one person right at the head of it. You're talking about a dynamic that's slowly going to take time. You're talking about generations of learned behavior. So just one email from somebody is not going to change that family dynamic. I guarantee if I went on to ancestry.com and looked up my relatives and, I guarantee you that 150 years ago in Germany or however long ago, family dynamic was the same. They probably didn't talk about any of this stuff in Bavaria, I mean, so some poor guy, my family probably came back from the Franco-Prussian War and nobody talked to him about it, I mean, because that's just the way the dynamic was. So I think it's got to be an approach of being indirect, of not getting the defenses up, and also too the idea that this is going to be a process. It's going to take a while, but and gradually getting into it rather than jumping into it and then it becomes, because I think when you jump into it, then it becomes confrontational, or can become confrontational, or then the reactive statements coming up of, you'll always be a hero to us no matter what you say, things like that may not be helpful to the veteran, or of course you can do it, this is just something you have to work through, or any of the other, types of unhelpful, that comes from a place of wanting to help, right? That comes from a good-heartedness, that comes from a kind intent. But, a lot of people, their understanding of mental health issues is, well, you just need to get out of the funk. You just need to go take a walk. You just need to exercise, or, how about getting you a dog? A dog might cheer you up, or something like that. So I think the other part I would say, Evelyn, is just the education process, for families, because maybe that's part of it too. Families just don't know how to approach. They're afraid of making a mistake. They're afraid of treading too too aggressively, or saying something wrong. But yeah, I don't envy your job though, Evelyn, because changing families is, my God, good luck to you.
Well, no, I appreciate that, because that is somewhat of the thinking or the thought process around providing some help to families, because you're correct. It is a process, very much like it was a process for you and for others who are experiencing PTSD and TBI. But I just sort of wanted to hear it from you in regard to your own family experience and dynamics, what you thought would be helpful, because
Yeah.
it then helps us understand that, yes, we're on the right track here in terms of our approaches to what we think would be helpful to families in terms of dealing with this.
Yeah, and I'll say with mine, it was definitely like the more passive, indirect approach, them reading things that I wrote, or them watching things where I spoke publicly, and then having just moments with my parents where we didn't need to talk about it, but they communicated that they understood. They expressed sympathy for what I was going through. And it didn't have to be more than a minute or two of conversation, because I'm 47. I still have this awkwardness with them, right? That's not going to end. But I know that they understand, and I know that they know what I'm going through, and I know that they care, and I know that they would do anything, and they've expressed that to me. And it's been done in a way that was the best way to communicate within my family. So I think that's another part of it too, is just the families finding the right way to communicate to each other.
Yeah, and just as an FYI for people, I have put a handful of resources in the chat, a few on PTSD, a few on TBI, and then I did put a link to a link for families of service members with PTSD or veterans with PTSD, called Coaching into Care. I posted the one link and just tested it, and something was stuck on it. So just in case, I also posted their Facebook link. But feel free to check those out, in case they might be of interest to you. I want to go back to another comment that had been submitted in the chat earlier. How do you think the military can support the mental health of officers who are having this experience? And, Matt, you were mentioning how you're walking one of your folks over, right, to the hospital with suicidal ideation, getting him checked in, while all the while sort of having your own kind of stuff going on, and not necessarily seeking help for yourself. So any thoughts on anything that can be done at that level?
Yeah, and within the military, you've got various levels of leadership. So it's just not officers. It's what are called non-commissioned officers. Your
right, NCOs.
And, yeah, and then you have senior enlisted, or what we call in the Marine Corps staff NCOs. Which are your men and women who've been in for more than 10 years, basically, is the easiest way to put it. And so at all those levels of leadership, you have this assumption of responsibility and obligation where you put others first. That's the idea behind it. It doesn't always work out that way. You get some bad leaders in all walks of life, right? But you're gonna what it is one, I think, and you have seen this from some officers and senior enlisted, is a willingness to speak about their own problems. Mm-hmm. However, that has been greatly impacted by two things. One is security clearances. Yeah. Is that if you have a security clearance, you are scared to death that if you admit to having any type of mental health issue, even going to couples counseling with your wife or your husband, that will jeopardize your security clearance. And there are plenty of examples of that being true. And I know people in my own life who work for the federal government, who are scared that they will lose. This is just not a military thing, but a civilian thing, at the State Department or the Central Intelligence Agency or whatever, that you will lose your ability to have your job because you admitted to going to speak to a therapist. Yeah. God forbid if you're on medication, right? So that's a real issue, a real problem. The second is career progression. There is a great fear, and again, I think it's warranted, that this will be a career killer. That if you go and talk to someone about PTSD or having problems or depression or substance abuse or whatever, that you are not going to be promoted. And that, of course, is true in many ways, but for the basic reason also, too, that as you climb that pyramid, You can't have any mistakes. You can't have any errors. You can't have anything that will disqualify you in your competition with others to be promoted. So those two things really inhibit people from going to get help. There are a number of things that can be done about that, though. One, you can make mental health screening and counseling and treatment hidden, private, secret, that it is not available to be seen by promotion boards, that your commanding officers and your sergeant majors have no access to that type of thing. In terms of security clearance, something like that does not have to be disclosed when you're going to get your secret or your top secret clearance renewed, which occurs, top secret clearance has to be renewed every 5 years. So every 5 years, you got to go through the whole thing of filling out the paperwork. Somebody comes to your house, you got to give them 3 friends to go talk to, et cetera, et cetera. So, just those things alone, by making it private, by making it unable to be disclosed, I think would be a great thing to help men and women get the help they need. And then of course there's education, there's stigma, there is the moral injury piece is politically fraught. The military has no interest in, there have been some chaplains in the military, there have been some military officers and others who've spoken about this, but from what I've seen from the Pentagon, from the institution, the idea of moral injury is politically fraught, because now you're admitting that U.S. soldiers did things that are wrong, right? That these wars are not morally valuable, that these wars, right? I mean, so that's a very fraught political issue for the Pentagon to accept. You do have certain commanders that do. There are certain bases that have allowed, certain base commanders across the United States that have allowed, various training teams to come on and speak about moral injury. And there are other bases, like at Fort Bragg, where a local group that does a lot of work on this, a Quaker group, they've been allowed to go on the base and talk about all kinds of other things, but they're not allowed to talk about moral injury. So, I think there's a number of things that can be done, but I think that the most important is keeping those mental health records private and allowing people to get the help they need without the stigma. You also had in the military straightening this out, but the idea, the discharges for PTSD, the discharges for substance abuse. I can give you an example. I had a young kid in my company. He was 18 years old, youngest Marine in my company. He was a welder. He had learned how to weld as a teenager and everything. And what we had him doing was every time that somebody was killed in an IED attack and their body was so wrapped into that metal that it couldn't be pulled out, we sent, Lance Corporal Dunlop out there with his welding equipment and had him cut the body parts out. He had to do that on Christmas Eve one time, I remember. And we sent him home without any help. And then he detached from my company. And in a year or so later, I heard he got kicked out of the Marine Corps with a bad conduct discharge for smoking marijuana. No one ever asked him why he was smoking marijuana. Maybe he was smoking marijuana because his friends were smoking marijuana. I have a pretty good feeling he was smoking marijuana to try and cope with the idea of having to cut bodies. I don't even know how many he did, at least 20 probably, as an 18-year-old or 19-year-old now, and then giving no help for that. And then he gets kicked out with a bad conduct discharge, which denies him access to the VA. Right. And now, of course, he can appeal all that. But one, does he even know he can appeal it? And two, I can't even imagine what that, being as someone who has dealt with the board, with BCNR, the Board for the Correction of Naval Records, I can't even imagine what that process is like, how many years that will take, right? And so you have a lot of that as well, too. This idea of punishing guys and not asking them, not, oh, hey, you cut body part, and then all the other things, too. So what you have is this self-medicating that goes on in public, and because alcohol is allowed, most guys in the military turn to alcohol. A lot don't. There's been a lot of history of opioid abuse, particularly this last 10 years, guys trying to deal with that, pain management and everything. But the alcohol is what I find most guys, because that's what's allowed, so they destroy themselves with alcohol. And the results are as you can imagine.
And there's a lot of discussion going in the chat too. I see on this idea of stigma, but not just stigma. It's consequences, the clearance issues, the disclosures, the do not, then do not arm, there are a lot of sort of consequences that come from acknowledging and stepping up to help. And I think until we can figure out a way to navigate that, it's going to be tough to sort of, get people to change their minds on this kind of thing. We are running, it's 2:22, so we got about 8 minutes left. I do just want to, we've got another question in the chat. Again, I want to remind people that if you're interested in some of the resources, check the chat a little bit further up and you'll find some links there. But let's take a look at this next question, which was from your experience, Matt, this would see you. From your experience, what was the best way for a therapist to relate or interact with you during your treatment? If you experienced resistance during treatment, what was the most successful way for them to reach you?
My first therapist had been a corpsman in Vietnam, and that's the only reason why I trusted him. Mm-hmm. I remember and he was a private therapist, because I went to the VA in 2012, and it was such a bad experience. And I felt that nobody had any idea of what I was talking about. The lady who did my intake, the nurse, she didn't know what a captain in the Marine Corps was, right? So immediately I was like, these people don't know anything I'm going through. I can't trust them. And Lenny Brinzendine, was a therapist. He's now retired. I trusted him because he knew what I was talking about. And that's a big problem. This is a very real problem for men and women coming out of the military. If you're not going to, you have this feeling that, how can I speak to you if you've never carried a rifle? How do you know what I'm talking about? So you've got to break through that. And so I think it's, certainly now I've gotten past that, and it took me, but even still a year in therapy after I moved out of North Carolina, after dealing with Lenny for a year, my psychologist, Dr. Berlin, I remember first meeting with her, and, here's this lady who's, short, petite, she's younger than I am, what the hell does she know about what I'm gonna be talking about? How can I trust her? And it really comes down to a trust issue, I think. So, how do you break through that? Other than having like all these frontline therapists who were prior military, which is an impossibility. I think it comes down, you gotta get back to the idea of education, of talking about this stuff while they're still in service, of trying to get that idea in their head about having people come in and speak about it while men and women are still on active duty, so that before they leave active duty, they've got more of a willingness to speak with someone who may not have worn a uniform. It's very, and this idea too that our suffering, and this is one of the things that I like to speak a lot about, the idea that suffering is suffering. That regardless of what your source of the PTSD is, what your experience is, why you have it, it's still suffering. But we create this hierarchy, and you hear it so often. I'll talk to people who are non-combat PTSD. One woman I know whose mother used to take knives and keep them heated every day in the oven to burn her children when they did something wrong, right? That's how she grew up. And she says to me, but what I went through is nothing compared to what you went through. So this hierarchy of trauma, this hierarchy of suffering is something I think that has to be really dealt with. And the education needs to be really understanding that suffering is suffering. And with that, when you have that, then you're willing to speak to people who may not have the same background as you, who may not look like you, who may be older, younger, whatever. But that's a real problem is being, and then the willingness to listen, the willingness to, I know a lot of vets who have walked into VA offices, whether they be hospitals or clinics or CPOCs or whatever, and have immediately walked out because they've been hit with a barrage of thank you for your service. Veterans are our heroes, models of airplanes, all kinds of motivational kinds of things that go directly against their experience, that right away says, if you're feeling shame for what you did in the war, or your experience wasn't this parade-like fantasy, then you are not going to be welcome here. And so there's a lot of how, when you're receptive to veterans, what you're willing to, how you're approaching them. If you walk up to me and say, you know, you're a hero and everything else, no, the first thing it makes me think of is what I did, what I took part in. Like, it makes me think of things of 2006, 2007 that were, if I was from another nation, I'd be at the, you know, it'd be a war crime, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, there's that kind of thing, or the approach that you take. So again, that being receptive, being listening, let them speak, you know, you know, but it is hard again because of the culture. The Marine, you know, the culture coming out of the military. It's hard for these young men and women to think that anyone is going to understand what they went through. It's just
Yeah.
again, another process, you know, another process.
Yeah, really, really, I think key points. And I think, you know, in some ways it speaks to a little bit of what we've actually talked about, the Mason's MVFI, the Military Veteran Family Initiative, with Veteran Health Wellness Foundation, about how to start to try to create more awareness for, you know, students who are coming through and getting ready to go into the professional realm to understand those things, right? So that, because you're right, we're not going to get to the point where we have all frontline therapists have military experience, right? It's like, you know, it's a pipe dream, right? But we could try to get to a point where we've got a cadre of therapists who are fully trained in understanding these things, right? So that they can get over some of those barriers, right? They're not going to be able to get over them all, right? We live in an imperfect world, but if we can help them move somewhat down the road, you know, that's something. And I think that you know, things like this, things like yourself taking time to talk to folks who, you know, who have had potentially a lot of similar experiences to you, but also to folks to learn from that, right? You know, because they want to help and they need to learn how. And so I really would just want to thank you again for taking the time and being as open with us and sharing this, your experience and your thoughts. It's been really meaningful, really, really helpful. And I think just yeah, great experience for us. Want to also thank all of you, you know, who joined us, you know, and for this time. This has been a good experience. I hope you're taking some things away from it. Thanks to Evelyn and to Veteran Health and Wellness Foundation for helping us get this together, and to Leslie for helping us run the whole thing and run the show and keeping the chat going and making sure I wasn't missing things as we went.